Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha. Today we'll start a multi-part series that looks at why we meditate on suttas. This first session today will give a sort of bird's eye view of answering that question and some support behind why it's important to meditate on suttas. The following sessions will look at nyanapathas or knowledge pathways, because the crux of the Suttas is actually unlocking the Buddha's code, and the code itself is contained within Nyanapatha. Now, Nyanapatha translates as, firstly, Jnana translates as knowledge or wisdom or even insight, and Patha means pathway. So when you combine the two, you get wisdom pathway, knowledge pathway, or even insight pathway. And so when we focus on that code is actually unlocking the insight of the teaching of the Buddha. And when you follow it, the Buddha says that you will get a particular result, one way or another. And usually what you see with the method of instruction in the suttas is that Buddha says, if you meditate in this way, you'll get this result. And when you meditate in that way, you'll get this other result. And when you look at the predicament, like the bigger picture of our predicament, what Buddha is saying, usually in the suttas, is if you meditate along this wrong knowledge pathway, the unwholesome way, the akusala, then what happens is that you will continue in samsara, that you will either have some kind of birth, and depending on your karma, you will have a good rebirth or a not so good rebirth. Now, then the Buddha usually says in the sutta that if you meditate in another way, which is the kusala side, and usually what the Buddha is teaching us is the higher virtue, the higher concentration of mind, and the higher wisdom, then you will get this result that will lead towards insight, and it will lead towards Nibbāna, essentially, like in an ultimate sense, and so you free yourself from samsara. So basically that is why we meditate on suttas. In a nutshell, it's really going back to the actual instructions of the Buddha, that those that have actually seen that there is this method of instruction, then you seek out how to actually do these sutta meditations. And what we fail to see is that when we actually go away from the suttas, then the teaching actually gets diluted. We start to miss the meaning and the actual precision of the teachings of the Buddha. And so you don't get that result. You actually end up in danger, at risk of still going from birth to birth, because you actually can't unlock the code. And essentially you can't actually remove the links of the paticcasamuppada, the links of the dependent origination. So you're basically stuck in samsara. So in the following sessions, what we'll look at is some examples of that. And if you've been listening to this series, then you've actually started to unlock that anyway. Like if you take the most recent uploads, when you look at the Karani Metta, you can essentially see that knowledge or insight pathway being developed. And you actually follow the precise instructions of the Buddha to actually cultivate the Metta Bhavana. So in a nutshell, that's what we'll be looking at. In the Mahā Parinibbāna Sutta, which is in the Digha Nikaya, and those are the longer discourses, and this one is discourse number 16, and it's all about the Buddha's last days. And during that time, Venerable Ananda was actually pressing the Buddha about what would happen after he passes away, and whether he would nominate someone to lead the Sangha. And the Buddha actually responded to Venerable Ananda by saying, "Now, Ananda, if it occurs to any of you, the teacher's dispensation has passed, now we have no teacher, but you should not see it like this. The Dhamma and Vinaya that I have taught and pointed out for you shall be your teacher after my passing. Now this is quite an important statement from the Buddha, because the Buddha didn't even nominate his chief disciples, being Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahā. Instead, he actually nominated the Dhamma and Vinaya. So the Dhamma being the teaching, so all the teachings that fall under the Buddha's dispensation, and the Vinaya being the training rules. So the training rules that commence with the 5 precepts all the way up to the Vinaya that the monastic Sangha hold and Patimokkha. And when you look at it like that, there's an implication here that he hasn't passed it to any specific person. And during the time of the Buddha, when you know about the noble disciples, the great disciples of the Buddha, and that they're fully awakened and perfected on the path that the Buddha has set, then that's really saying something. So there's an implication that even in modern times now, that if we raise something higher than Dhamma and Vinaya, there is a risk. And so that's something that needs to be investigated, contemplated. And where Sutta meditation comes in actually falls in line with that, because when you meditate on Suttas, you're actually looking at the Dhamma and the Vinaya. Vinaya in the sense of Adi Sila, which is the higher virtue that we are training towards, and Dhamma being the teachings themselves, the actual instructions of the Buddha or the instructions of an enlightened noble Arahant. The other reference from the Mahā Parinibbāna Sutta is in the Digha Nikaya, of course, longer discourse, again, discourse number 16. And the Buddha's gathered the Sangha in an assembly hall and is giving them a teaching. And the Buddha says to them, "So mendicants, having carefully learned the Dhamma I have taught you from my special knowledge, one should cultivate, develop and practice frequently so that the purity of this spiritual life may last for a long time, for the welfare and happiness of a mass of people, with compassion for the world, for the benefit, welfare and happiness of gods and humans. And what is the Dhamma I have taught from my special knowledge? They are the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 bases of spiritual power, the 5 spiritual faculties, the 5 powers, the 7 awakening factors, and the Noble Eightfold Path." Now what's really interesting about this particular statement from the Buddha is that given his special knowledge, he's actually encouraging the monks and nuns to actually cultivate, develop and practice frequently. So that's bhavita, bahulikata, yanikata, which is something you commonly find in the Pali Canon, and to actually develop really well. And the reference to Dhamma here is very specific. It's actually to the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, which are the 37 requisites for enlightenment or Nibbana. So he emphasizes the Satipatthana, which is the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Samappadana, which is the right efforts, the Iddhipadas, which are the bases of spiritual power, the Indriyas, which are the spiritual faculties, and the Balas, which are the powers. And then you have the Bojjhangas, which are the awakening factors. And then finally you have the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the Arya-tangika Magga. So when you actually develop the path, what you're actually developing within most of the Pali Canon, particularly the middle or longer teachings of the Buddha, is you're actually being taught how to develop these 37 requisites, and in a very systematic way, a very, very gradual way. And the most important thing is that if you don't follow Sutta meditations, then it's not necessarily quite clear that you're actually developing these things, particularly if it's not explicitly given to you. Now, if you're taking instruction from a particular teacher, it's really good to ask whether what they're teaching you is actually activating or developing these 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, and in a very methodical, gradual, sequential sense. Because what you find in the Suttas is that is exactly what Buddha does. One of the things that is quite important to understand is what leads to the decline and disappearance of true Dhamma versus what leads to the non-decline and non-disappearance of true Dhamma. And this particular sutta is actually quite useful to understand. It's the Sugata Vinaya Sutta, which is in the Anguttara Nikaya, so that's the numerical discourses, and it's in chapter 4 and it's discourse 160. And there are 4 things that the Buddha says leads to the decline and disappearance of true Dhamma. The first one relates to memorizing the discourses and learning them incorrectly with misplaced words and phrases. And so when you have misplaced words and phrases, the meaning is misinterpreted. So that's the first thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of true Dhamma. The second one is mendicants are difficult to admonish, so they're duvacho, so they have qualities that make them difficult to admonish, being impatient, and they don't take instruction respectfully. So if you've read the Anumana Sutta, then you know what that means. Then you also have mendicants who are learned, and so they know a lot, they've memorized the teachings and also the Vinaya. But the problem is that they don't make others recite those discourses, and so when they pass away, the discourses are cut off at the root. So they may be very learned, like Bahusutta, but what happens is when they pass away, there's no one left to actually continue, and so Dhamma starts to decline. The fourth one is senior mendicants are indulgent and slack, leaders in backsliding, neglecting seclusion, not rousing energy for attaining the unattained, achieving the unachieved, and realizing the unrealized. And so anyone who follows their example will be the same. Now, why this is important with respect to sutta meditation is that the Buddha started out teaching, and it was very much an oral tradition, and so memorization was very, very important. And I do know that there are some people who have a huge issue with suttas being, or teachings being written down, and so they refuse to look at the Pali Canon in any way because they feel that Buddha had said as one of those things that it shouldn't be written down. Now, when you look at the actual Pali Canon, including the Vinaya, what's said is that it's just a minor issue or minor infraction for having written it down. Now, if you understand at the time, 500 years after the Buddha, maybe even 100 years after the Buddha, there were challenges that were arising within the Sangha, and there were challenges that meant there were people breaking off into different lineages and traditions, and there were disputes about whether to have less rules and all things like that. And so when it came to much further down the line and the fact that these things were then able to be written down, I think there was also, one has to also take on board that there probably was a fear amongst some of the Sangha that the teachings would be lost if they weren't written down, because there were Sangha members who were no longer memorizing them, and even if they were memorizing them, they were memorizing them incorrectly, as the Buddha has actually indicated is a problem. And so when you do that, the meaning cannot be really well understood. It can be actually misinterpreted or subverted. And then there were all these other things. And so when you actually look at the suttas themselves, and especially when there's repetition throughout the Pali Canon, that you see certain teachings of the Buddha and the Noble Arahants, that they match up, then you can have confidence in those things. And you can actually see that the sequence, the method of instruction is pretty much the same. That when it's offered in one particular part of the Sutta Pitaka versus another part, when you put them side by side and they're repeating themselves, they're actually giving you confidence that this was a true teaching. Now, when there are obscure teachings, then that often does beg the question, is that something that was added later? It doesn't appear to be something that the Buddha was very strongly propounding. But the other thing that comes to mind is that when the Buddha has taught, and you read widely within the Pali Canon, so you read widely in terms of whether it's a saying of the Buddha, a verse of the Buddha, Buddha answering questions and giving answers, or maybe it's even birth stories of the noble disciples of the Buddha, or even the Buddha's past history, like the different Buddhas. all the things that appear in both the major and minor discourses and the actual sutta discourses themselves, what you find is you start to become very, very conscious of the flavor of Buddha's teachings, that the non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion comes very strong as the fragrance that is set within his teachings. And not only that, when he answers questions about different religions at the time, some of those answers are very, very penetrative, and you get a particular fragrance, a particular undertone that comes with the Buddha's teachings, and most of it is always around adisila, adichitta, adipanya. So that's higher virtue, the higher concentration of the mind, and the higher wisdom. And usually some people, when they read the suttas and they haven't got access to the Buddha's code quite yet, what happens is people think that it's very repetitive. But what you don't see, and which we'll come to in a few slides along, is that Buddha has a particular way of teaching, a method of instruction that helps one to see how you cause something to arise and how you then not cause it to arise. And that's what the Buddha is actually instructing you to see. As the fully enlightened Buddha, Gautama Buddha actually had the three knowledges, but he also had other supernormal powers, and he could foretell certain things, and you get that impression when you read certain parts of the Pali Canon. One of those is in the Ani Sutta, which is in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 20, and it's discourse number 7. And the Buddha says, in a future time, there will be mendicants who won't want to listen when discourses spoken by the realized one, deep, profound, transcendent, dealing with emptiness, are being recited. They won't pay attention or apply their minds to understand them, nor will they think those teachings are worth learning and memorizing. But when discourses composed by poets, poetry with fancy words and phrases, composed by outsiders or spoken by disciples, are being recited, they will want to listen. They'll pay attention and apply their minds to understand them, and they'll think those teachings are worth learning and memorizing. And that is how the discourses spoken by the realized one, deep, profound, transcendent, dealing with emptiness, will disappear. Now, we're almost 2,600 years after the Buddha, and you can see outside of spiritual practice that already there is a lot more emphasis or confidence placed in things like science or other aspects of mundane knowledge. And then when you come to spiritual practice, you see that there's a lot of mixing up of even the Buddha's teachings. You have fake Buddha quotes, you have Buddha's teachings mixed with Hinduism, mixed with some Christian ascetics. You see it mixed with even things that are made up. And so when you receive a teaching now, it's not as authentic, particularly when people don't actually refer back to the suttas. The suttas at least give you what the Buddha had said or the noble arahants had said. And so the more you go away from what would be as close as we have to the Buddha's teachings, then what will happen is you dilute and pretty much almost like destroy the Buddha's actual teachings themselves. And so when people look forward to listening to all these other things, sometimes you hear more teachings that, yes, they're by charismatic teachers, they're filled with jokes, all kinds of different methods of delivery. But what you find is that there's a dilution. The Buddha, the Arahants, they don't normally joke. In fact, they never joke because they understand the Four Noble Truths. And so when you understand the predicament that we are all in, there is really nothing much to joke about, not even to try and draw people into the teaching. And so this is something that really needs to be taken on board, that there is something in us where we don't even want to look at suttas. And as I was saying before, some people refuse to even look at suttas. But the thing is, once you start to see that there is a method of instruction within the suttas, then you don't want to go too far away from it, because that is where the key is, that is where the insight is. and that is where the knowledge or insight pathway comes in order to free oneself. So the Buddha's teaching is actually being divided into like 9 parts, and in this way what the Buddha is saying is that it's through his verses, through his suttas or discourses, through even the birth stories and answering questions contained within the suttas, different kinds of explanations, that's how you glean the actual teachings of the Buddha, the actual method of instruction of the Buddha. And you see this reference throughout the Sutta Pitaka, that the Pali Canon in its entirety actually makes reference to this. And so if you just think that one just takes certain meditation instructions, no, one actually needs to investigate the different parts to the Buddha's teachings to actually get the actual insight, the actual instructions from the Buddha or even the Noble Arahants. And you see this reference in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, but then you also find it in some of the minor discourses. So you see it referenced in the Pettakopadesa, where it says in order to actually understand the meaning and phrasing of the Buddha, that you go into these 9 different aspects in order to find out that I guess the Buddha's code. And so these 9 divisions start with suttas, which are discourses. You also find it as mixed prose or songs, geyang. Then you have Vyakarana, which is the explanations. Then you have verses, which are in poetic form. So these are the gathas. Sometimes we chant those. And then you have like udana, which is like the inspired utterances of particularly the Buddha. And then you have the Itivuttaka, which is actually those quotes that were gathered by Kujuttara Upasika. And then you have the Jatakas, which are the birth stories. So a lot of the time people don't refer to those, but they actually contain a lot of very useful information, a lot of things that inspire the practice, but also the sense of urgency. And then you also have amazing stories, which is the Abhuta Dhammas. And then finally you have Vedlang, which is some form of subtle analysis or even questions and answers that are contained within the Buddha's teachings. And so when we apply ourselves to these different types of teachings, types of parts to the Buddha's teachings, or those of the Noble Arahants, then you start to get the true Dhamma. What is the actual meaning behind the Buddha's teaching? Then we have the Buddha's learning system, which is something that is not often discussed or explicitly mentioned when it comes to meditation. And the Buddha's learning system is referenced particularly in the Sekapatipada Sutta, which is in the middle-length discourses, Majjhima Nikaya, and it's number 53. And with the Buddha's learning system, what you find is that it's very much a sequential and gradual approach. But often the key parts of what the Buddha is actually emphasizing in his learning system is actually to retain what you've heard or read and to actually accumulate that knowledge and then to actually be able to recite it back out again and to know, I guess in the sense of meditation, to actually know the steps. And then also in terms of that, to be able to investigate it with your mind. And the most important thing is actually with his learning system, he's always correcting our view, because with the right view, then you practice the right pathway. And so that's something that's very, very important when it comes to the Buddha's learning system. So when you go down this particular list, and this is what the Buddha says in the Sekapatipada Sutta to learners or trainees on the path, that he said, one has learned much, remembers what one has learned, consolidates what one has learned, such teachings as are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, and with the right meaning and phrasing, and affirm a holy life that is utterly perfect and pure. Such teachings as these one has learned much of, remembered, recited verbally, investigated with the mind, and penetrated well by view. So when you look at it this way, you can see the emphasis is that it's good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. And with most suttas, you can actually see, when we look at sutta architecture in general, you can see that flow within the Buddha's teaching itself. And then on top of that, when you follow that, the Buddha emphasizes the right meaning and phrasing. Because as we saw before, that if you don't memorize it correctly, you lose the right meaning and you lose the right phrasing, and so the teaching can be misinterpreted. So there's something very specific about that. Then when you actually look at this particular sequence of the Buddha's learning system, you need to remember what you've heard or what you've learned. You need to store it so that you can access it again. You need to read more widely or listen to more of the Buddha's teachings. You then need to be able to memorize it. Then you need to actually be able to recite it back out, or even to share it with others, maybe express it. And then you want to actually be able to practice it, and then to practice it frequently. And then you mentally examine, in terms of like almost Dhamma-Vicaya, that you actually investigate the Dhamma itself and crack it open. And then finally, with the right view, you actually realize the truth of the teaching and you penetrate it well, which leads to different path and fruit and ultimately to Nibbāna. So there's something very key about the Buddha's learning system that we need to actually understand. And the only way to do that is actually through the suttas themselves. I've been referencing Buddha's method of instruction, and where this comes from is Buddha explicitly speaks about it in the Kevadda Sutta, which is in one of the longer discourses, and it's number 11. And the Buddha distinguishes between 3 specific kinds of miracles. And the first 2 are more psychic. So the iddhis are one of them, so the psychic abilities. The second one is telepathy, which is adesana. And then the third one is anusasani, patihariyang, which is the miracle of instruction. So when you go to the suttas, what you normally find, and people find this repetitive, is Buddha will give instructions like, if you do this, you'll get this negative result. If you then do this, you'll get this favorable result and you'll gain this, and if you persevere in it, then the path to liberation is actually can be realized. Now, what Buddha is saying to Kevadda in this sutta is that there's danger if you just practice towards iddhis, like psychic abilities or the telepathy, and rather what he says is practice for the miracle of instruction, and this is what he says is the more superior part of cultivating the path. With the method of instruction, Buddha mentions it again as one example in the Udaya Sutta, and this is the advice that Buddha gives if one wants to actually share Dhamma. So he's having a conversation with Venerable Ananda, and he says, it's not easy to teach the Dhamma to others, Ananda. The Dhamma should be taught to others only when 5 qualities are established within the person teaching. Which 5? The Dhamma should be taught thinking, 1, I will speak step by step. So this literally means a gradual teaching. The second is, I will speak as one seeing the method of instruction or study. The third is, I will speak out of compassion. The fourth is, I will speak not out of desire for gain. And the fifth is, I will speak without hurting myself or others. Now the reference to the second quality, which is pariyaya dasavi, which means, you need to see the method of instruction, otherwise you can't teach it to somebody else. So if someone hasn't actually seen the method of instruction within a sutta, then it makes it quite difficult. Now, what you find now is that people know bits and pieces of the Buddha's teaching, but what's missing is the complete insight pathway or the complete instruction. And if someone hasn't actually studied that, then it becomes very difficult to, 1, teach the Dhamma to someone else, particularly specifically what the Buddha has taught. But secondly, what they're teaching may be teaching towards the wrong path if it's not complete. And if the words are not understood properly, if the words are not even memorized properly, if you remember, then what happens is one can misguide someone and you won't get the actual result that the Buddha explicitly says. Usually in his teachings, he'll say, if you do this, you'll get this result. If you do this other thing, you'll get that result. Now, on the positive side of, if you do the positive thing, that you walk the path or contemplate in a particular way to get the favorable insight, if you're not given that, then you won't develop that insight. And maybe you will also be hindered in terms of there'll still be hindrances, there'll still be mental defilements, and there'll still be obstructions. So that's pretty important, that somebody needs to be able to see the method of instructional study. And it's not just any method or instructional study, it's specifically what the Buddha has instructed in the suttas. So as I was saying, when you look at the suttas, usually you'll find a particular sequence. So if we look at this as just a standard sutta architecture, it may not apply to all, but most of them. You usually start with an opening statement. So you find out who the Buddha is teaching, or who a noble arahant is teaching, whether it's someone who's come to visit the Buddha, or whether the Buddha has gone somewhere and something's happened and then he's been invited to teach. And then the second part is you get, these are the qualities that hinder the path. And it could be in answer to a question, or it could be a teaching that is given to the Sangha or to a lay person. And then the third part is normally you see the opposite of that. You see the qualities that would support the path. And so he gives you an insight pathway to develop that. And then lastly, you get a concluding statement and a summing up of the teaching. And so the sutta architecture actually complements Buddha's method of instruction. And once you start to see it, you start to see the code. So within the suttas, there's a code or a knowledge pathway, sometimes also insight pathway. It's referred to as nyanapathas. So jnana can be wisdom, it can be knowledge, it can be insight, and patha is normally pathway. So usually what you actually find in a sutta is you see the pathway that hinders the path, as in the overall Noble Eightfold Path, and then you also see the pathway that that supports the path, that gives you the insight that leads to ultimate liberation, or at least if you don't realize ultimate liberation, you actually are realizing a good destination at least. So that's something that's quite evident, and that's something that needs to be unlocked when you actually read the Pali Canon. To summarize this session, these were the few things that we covered, that Dhamma and Vinaya are our teachers, and so it comes to when we want the instructions from the Buddha, it's really contained within the actual teachings themselves, and also our training rules. And then secondly, we looked at the Buddha's teachings, that it comprises 9 different divisions to the teachings, and that we're meant to use all of those different types of divisions in order to understand the meaning and phrasing, so that we can interpret the teachings correctly. Also the learning system, that there's much more to the Buddha's learning system that needs to be understood, particularly the correcting of the right view as part of the learning system. And in order to actually, again, understand the teachings quite well, and in order to activate the actual insight pathways. And then another thing that was quite important was the 37 requisites of enlightenment, that when we actually take the teachings of the Buddha, that we actually understand that there are 37 requisites that need to be activated, that need to be understood and taught in order to actually develop the path, the Noble Eightfold Path. And thirdly, we looked at the miracle or method of instruction, that this is what the Buddha said was the superior part of the training, that we need to extract the actual precise instructions of the Buddha or the Noble Arahants, because in that way it leads to the fourth, which is the nyanapatha, or the insight or knowledge pathway, that when you actually follow the precise steps of the Buddha, that you're willing to listen to them, that when you actually can see it, or you seek someone out who actually sees that code of the Buddha, then it activates a particular insight pathway. And when that's activated, then you actually realize the truth of the Buddha's teaching, and you actually realize path and fruit. And in an ultimate sense, it's really to emphasize that the Buddha is teaching us this is the way out of samsara. And so when you do that, that ultimately leads to full awakening. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings find safety. Blessings of the Triple Gem to all of you. Wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.